As this timeline shows, the late neoclassical styles form a bridge between the 18th and 19th centuries. They grow from the neoclassical styles of the 18th century, continue to evolve into the 19th, and eventually give way to the revival styles and eclecticism of the Victorian era. As I've noted here on the timeline, the bridge they form is between the old world order and the new one. From the way societies had been structured and operated for hundreds, even thousands of years, to a complete restructuring brought about by, yes, the Enlightenment to a certain extent, but mostly by the Industrial Revolution. This timeline is simply to illustrate how the late neoclassical styles overlap with the Victorian age, more or less dissolving into it. We'll talk more about this later, but for now, as I always stress, it's important to know where you are in time, in history, and circa 1800 is where the late neoclassical styles sit. So why are they called the late neoclassical styles? Easy. They are later versions of the original neoclassical styles of the 18th century, later evolutions. The name tells us they are still neoclassical, but will be different than the earlier versions in some way. From the pair of images shown here, can you identify what the fundamental difference between them is? If you said that the late neoclassical chair is comprised of more authentic components, you'd be right. I'm sure you recognize the names of the chair parts noted here from the Klismos chair and other ancient furniture, such as animal feet and monopodia. An interesting point about context and characteristics here is this. The French had always favored gilding, but what do we have here? Solid, unadorned mahogany. Why? Here, the French are making use of the large quantities of mahogany they began importing from America after our revolution to help us get on our feet. But of course, in just a few years after 1789, it would be life-threatening in France to order or own expensive, luxurious gilded pieces. Why? Why would design become more simple and austere after 1789? Does the word guillotine suggest an answer? Here, I'm recalling for you some of the forms of furniture we saw in the ancient world. Can you think of a reason why there would be such a growing interest in authentic forms from classical antiquity? If you recall the excitement the discoveries of Herculaneum in Pompeii generated, you can begin to understand. The interest in archaeology continued to increase, and more architects and designers began traveling to Italy, the Mediterranean, even parts of Mesopotamia and beyond, to see first-hand original examples of ancient design and to learn what they could about those cultures. They brought this knowledge back with them and drew heavily upon these sources to create designs that were more closely and directly connected to original antique forms and ornaments. The desire for appropriateness, for applying a style that is meaningful in terms of use or context, was another way of expressing authenticity or truthfulness. An excellent example of this is how the United States and France, the first two democratic forms of government since antiquity, both aligned themselves with the style of the world's first democracy, Greece, as well as that of the Roman Republic. How auspicious that a deeper understanding of these styles and cultures should be emerging just as these two world-changing revolutions occurred. What I show you here is a famous painting of circa 1800 of an equally famous French socialite posed in Greek-style dress upon a couch that mimics the one seen in the Roman relief below. Another influential force, one that will continue to pick up steam as we plunge deeper into the 19th century, was that of the Romantic movement, which compelled people to take an interest in re-experiencing the past in as authentic a manner as possible. Between the end of the French Revolution and the appearance of the French Empire under Napoleon I, there were some transitional styles which we're not going to look at. Not much furniture was made, and when it was basically plain mahogany comprised of various amounts of authentic form and ornament. The most important style in terms of design history is the French Empire style. By 1804, it is safe again to display wealth, and the French elite begin imitating the style created for the emperor by his court designers, the architects Charles Percier and Pierre Fontaine. You can see examples of this style in the chair and desk featured in Napoleon's portrait here. Like Robert Adam and many others, Percier and Fontaine spent years in Italy examining authentic examples of ancient design, and this kind of knowledge was most appropriate for the image Napoleon wanted to cultivate. Napoleon fancied himself a great emperor, and as such was set on conquering much of the Western world and wrapping himself in the symbolism of the greatest and most powerful empires. Fortunately for him, antiquity was also a fertile source of this kind of imagery. New material from the greatest empire the Western world had ever known, the Roman Empire, was constantly becoming available, and so was that of a culture even more powerful in their time than Rome, Egypt, the land of the pharaohs. One of Napoleon's greatest ambitions, in fact, was to conquer Egypt, which he invaded twice. Though his military campaigns failed, he did succeed in appropriating the symbols of Egyptian might and glory through the thousands of studies made of Egyptian life and design by the teams of artists who accompanied him on these campaigns. These images captured popular imagination, fueled the first wave of Egyptomania in the West, and became a common feature of French Empire design. The only other French style we'll be looking at briefly from this period is the Louis-Philippe style, which you can review here and in the period and style handout. Images 8 and 9 show you some typical forms of French Empire armchairs, 9 being the most common. Notice how they communicate power and might, wealth and richness through grand scale, bold proportions, saturated color, rich gilding, and authentic, appropriate elements related to the Roman Empire and Egypt. And, of course, do not overlook, here and in examples that follow, that ancient symbol of godlike power, which the occupant of the chair absorbs when seated. What is that characteristic? The French Empire style often reflected Napoleon's military ambitions, and we see that expressed here quite clearly in the way Percier and Fontaine have evoked a battlefield tent, just as Napoleon would have used when out on a campaign. As this style required hundreds of yards of fabric, most often silk, produced, of course, by French mills, it did much to create demand for French textiles, which helped to rebuild this industry after the Revolution. Also clearly expressed here, the curule stool of classical antiquity, a table supported by monopodia, and painted ornament of Roman classical military scenes. So-called campaign furniture also became popular among the general public. Lightweight and trimmed in less expensive brass as opposed to gilt bronze, it mimicked the furniture used in military encampments and is still made and described by the term campaign furniture today. Perhaps the most famous example of this kind of tented interior was created not for Napoleon, but for his wife Josephine at their small chateau just outside of Paris. How many defining characteristics can you identify here? Napoleon's bedroom at Versailles is an example of what many French Empire rooms looked like when they were not evoking a tent. The fabrics were generally en suite, and note the painted furniture, which appeared at times when embargoes cut off access to mahogany. Here, too, we see a new piece of furniture that was a standard feature of Empire interiors, the center table. These tables were made in a variety of sizes with various bases, as shown here. But note what they all have in common. Even in the small table, The proportions of the forms are bold and monumental, consisting of broad, flat, geometric surfaces covered with plain mahogany veneer. Prominent sculpted and gilded elements recalling ancient Rome or Egypt are also commonly featured, as are light and delicate gilt bronze mounts of the same nature, or often scenes from classical myths. The pier table was another new piece to appear at this time, the typical form being flat in the back to sit against a wall, with two three-dimensional supports of some kind in the front. The back panel was often mirrored, perhaps, it has been suggested, so that ladies could examine the hem of their skirts for dirt when they arrived. The same defining characteristics as seen in the center tables are also featured here. Can you describe them? Here, a view and description of typical case pieces in the French Empire style. The bold, powerful, monumental architectural qualities are expressed again in the broad, flat, veneered surfaces supporting, again, incredibly delicate gilt bronze mounts, marrying two extreme opposites so successfully as the French are always able to do. Percier and Fontaine, of course, published a collection of their drawings, which, by the way, were done in a style very much like that used on Greek vases, a celebration of drawing in crisp black line, clarity, and articulated detail. Sound familiar? Even though France is terrorizing its neighbors, it is again leading the world in style, after a brief pause during the Revolution. And many of the basic elements of the Empire style will find expression in the late neoclassical styles of other countries. Here, just an example of classical drawing on a Greek vase compared to the style of Percier and Fontaine. Also noteworthy is how similar these details are to the quality of the extraordinary gilt bronze mounts we've seen. Between the fall of Napoleon in 1814-15 and the installation of Louis Philippe in 1830, style in France was more or less a debased form of the Empire style. But under Louis Philippe, we see at first any lingering luxurious details of the Empire style begin to disappear, leaving a simple, sensible style that had broad appeal for the new middle class, who now not only needed furniture, but also could afford to buy it, thanks to the onset of the Industrial Revolution. We will also begin to see recognizable classical forms begin to dissolve as the new context of the 19th century begins to take hold. Louis Philippe was a relative of Louis XVI, who had been spirited out of the country as a boy at the time of the Revolution and lived a very middle-class life in England and America. He was, it was thought, the perfect king for a new class of people who wanted a monarch but not an aristocrat. And this rendering of his bedroom shows us just how middle class he truly was. But it also illustrates its roots in the Empire style, as the beds in particular look very much like Empire furniture, minus the gilt bronze mounts. But there is another highly significant difference here. Part or all of these pieces were made by machines, which, among other things, filled the void left by the end of the great line of hand craftsmen trained by the guilds. The revolutionary government had dissolved the guilds, which they saw as servants of the aristocracy. As many of these highly skilled craftsmen had left the country during the Revolution, and the rest were now dying off, that advanced knowledge and skill was rapidly disappearing. This new world needed furniture forms like these chairs, the parlor chair shown in this image and the next. This is where the working man could relax upon arriving home from a hard day at the office. Many versions of them were made, and the customer could customize it to a degree. In some cases, authentic forms are still barely noticeable, but as the late neoclassical era is supplanted by the Victorian age, in chairs like these, we see classical forms begin to literally unwind, soften, and eventually dissolve away. In these two pieces, however, we still see the bold architectural proportions and broad, flat areas of veneer that were the foundation of the Empire style, but now without the luxurious and expensive gilt bronze mounts. Here, an example of a Louis-Philippe interior, and in this furniture we still see many of the hallmarks of the French Empire style, as well as the overall expression of that interest in authenticity that is so characteristic of the late neoclassical era. The Empire style is evident in the center table itself, as well as its broad, flat areas of plain veneer, but now, of course, lacking the gilt bronze. The seating pieces are also of plain veneer, but unlike some Louis-Philippe pieces, which can seem like distant relatives of classical forms, here we still see authentic forms clearly expressed. One of them is the large scrolling arms of the chairs in the back, which are so typical of the Louis-Philippe style in particular. Can you identify the other authentic characteristics? As we've come to expect, England will be a much more exotic mix than anywhere else. If we keep two key things in mind, though, authenticity and appropriateness, we'll see how it all hangs together under the late neoclassical umbrella. Moreover, though the looks are all very different, they are all called by one style name, Regency. Why Regency? Because the last of the Georges, George IV, was regent during an early phase of this style, and his taste often influenced it. As I did at the beginning of the French section, I'm showing you here a picture of an 18th century English neoclassical chair alongside an English late neoclassical chair, and you should be able to describe the differences easily. What are the authentic elements of the Regency chair? These are by the rather eccentric English aristocrat Thomas Hope. From a wealthy banking family, he had the time and means to indulge his interests and spent 7 years traveling in Italy and the Near East, collecting antiquities and learning all he could about ancient cultures and design. On his travels, of course, he met and befriended many architects and designers from other countries who were doing the same thing, Percier and Fontaine among them. When he returned to London, he purchased and renovated a house by Robert Adam, turning it into a museum for his collections. In both the walls hung in fabric and the style of drawing, among other things, you can see the influence of his French friends. Unable to find furniture he thought suitable for his new home, he designed his own, much of it like the pair of chairs you just saw. Bold proportions, stained black with gilded details. And rather than trying to draw clear connections between his pieces and ancient furniture, he seemed rather to combine a variety of inspirational sources, from classical antiquity, Egypt, and the ancient Middle East, in creative ways, the result of which were pieces with familiar antique elements, but whose forms were completely unique. In the drawing here of the room where he displayed his collection of Greek vases, the influence of the French Empire style, Percier and Fontaine, is again quite apparent. Can you say where and how? When we were talking about the Parthenon at the beginning of the course, I had mentioned the many ornamental sculptures of the gods and others the Greeks had created for the temple, which are known today as the Elgin marbles. And this is why. At that point in time, in the 19th century, the field of archaeology as we know it did not exist. Instead, wealthy amateurs like Thomas Hope, and in this case Lord Elgin, financed their own expeditions and simply laid claim to whatever they found. The British to this day argue that Elgin saved these masterpieces, which were lying around forgotten in a state of decay, by packing them up and bringing them back to England, where the British Museum was built to receive them, and where they still reside today. All worth the pilgrimage to see. But if Google Images is all you can do, I highly recommend it. Very little had been understood about ancient Greece before this point. The classical tradition the world was most familiar with had been transmitted by the Italian Renaissance, which, as you know, had a strong Roman bias. The recent discoveries of Herculaneum in Pompeii had only served to emphasize that influence. Now, during the late Neoclassical era, scholars began to study and understand the importance of the Greeks in the formation of classicism. All of this, of course, created a craze for things Greek, and we begin to have a style that is sometimes referred to as Greek Revival. This kind of English Regency interior is considered Greek Revival and was created around a foundation of simplicity of a kind never really seen in England before. The plain ceiling, walls, and floor, no pattern, no fabric, no rich materials, and the pair of Ionic columns separating a section of the room were all inspired by what was understood to be a Greek aesthetic. As for the furniture, the chair is, as you would expect, sober, plain, comprised of authentic forms adapted from the originals. But the sofa is one of those anomalies, and it will be the same in American Greek Revival. They are usually quite ornate, trimmed with gold Grecian ornament. Brighton Pavilion is that outlier that seems to have no place in this discussion of late neoclassical style. But remember, number 1, appropriateness, and number 2, this period is a bridge to the Victorian age. The Brighton Pavilion was built by the Prince Regent as a pleasure palace, a place where he could throw outlandish parties and cavort with his married mistress, far from the watchful eye of his parents. And what kind of design concept would you expect to see expressed in such a place? Certainly not that of a Greek temple or the Roman Forum. Exoticism is the key word, and in design history, exoticism always means non-Western. Of course, there is an entire world full of non-Western cultures to draw upon, and if you want the ultimate in exotic design, then make it eclectic exotic, a mix of all manner of colorful, foreign, amusing elements from China, Japan, India, far-off islands, even Eastern Europe. So in keeping with late neoclassical values, not only is this an appropriate design, but this fascination with novelty will also be a hallmark of the Victorian era. Another excellent example of Regency appropriateness, this room at Carlton House, the London residence of the Prince Regent. If it reminds you a bit of Josephine's bedroom at Malmaison, it should, as this is an expression of the French Empire style by British designers. Of course, it was the British who ended Napoleon's career, and when one culture conquers another, it is customary to appropriate their culture in some way as a symbol of that vanquishing. So here, the Regent has found an acceptable reason to showcase the style that every monarch in Europe was adopting, the French Empire style, without having to acknowledge French design dominance. It was totally appropriate for him to co-opt this style, which, as luck would have it, also happened to be the latest fashion. As you understand by now, English Regency style is eclectic. And here and in the next image are a few examples of the many different types of chairs made at this time. In the chairs on the right, hopefully you can 1. Recognize their relation to the French Empire style, and 2. Identify authentic forms and ornaments. The chair on the left is interesting because it uses authentic details from Greek chairs that reflect their close connection to the sea and shipping. And as an island nation with an international seafaring, trading empire, the English, of course, appreciated and adopted those symbols. The large scrolling arms, which we also saw in the Louis Philippe style, are often depicted in antiquity as waves or scrolling sail cables. Here we see that element showcased, as well as the use of a cable detail at the crest rail. Caning, as we've seen often before, always evokes exotic, far-off lands, usually with which the country is trading or which they have made part of their empire. Exoticism is a common element of Regency design, in large part due to the taste of the Prince Regent, later George IV, and his circle, as we've seen in the Brighton Pavilion. These chairs are just 2 examples of the many kinds of typical Regency chairs, versions of which are still popular and made today. On the left, authentic forms are still visible, but paired with elaborate turning, caning, faux finishes, and painted details are very decorative and exotic, qualities that will also be quite popular in the Victorian age. On the right, authentic forms support similar ornamentation, including a painted vignette of an exotic scene adopted from contemporary literature, a romantic detail that, again, points directly towards the Victorian era. Here, a similar kind of surface elaboration through either faux treatment or an exotic veneer. These table forms arose in England during the Regency and are still made and still very popular today. When we move to America, there's an uptick again in stylistic terminology. Here you see the 4 different styles that took shape, roughly in this order, during the late neoclassical period. What you hopefully notice right away is their relationship to authentic classical forms and to the French Empire and Louis-Philippe styles. As I've done before, here I'm comparing an 18th century neoclassical chair, which of course in America is called federal, to a late neoclassical one. Logically then, the first of the late neoclassical styles in America is referred to as late federal. By now, you should be able to identify the authentic characteristics of this late neoclassical chair by Duncan Phyfe, including the curule style base. Phyfe is not only one of the most famous American furniture designers and makers, he's also the perfect expression of the context of this era. He produced a large body of very high-quality furniture for the upper middle-class market by combining early machine industrial techniques with the skills of hand craftsmanship. The eagle motif in the chair back is typical of the patriotic themes that celebrated the values and identity of the new nation in all American decorative arts at this time. And notice the table in that form that became so popular in England during the Regency. Here, a sofa by Duncan Phyfe with characteristic late federal authentic forms and ornaments. Reading is a detail especially associated with Phyfe. And the caning, of course, reflects the ongoing influence of increased international trade. Beyond adding a sense of novelty, it's also practical, as it makes for a resilient surface upon which cushions can be placed and a less expensive sofa than a fully upholstered one. Here, a typical late federal interior, including the Duncan Phyfe pieces we just saw. The intimate, casual atmosphere that had developed in the Age of Elegance is still favored, but it's now paired with the matching, intensely hued upholstery of the French Empire style. The panoramic wallpaper, made more affordable with the aid of machines, provided a focal point for conversations, as those gathered could visit and revisit cities such as Paris, Rome, or London that surrounded them. This wonderful view of a late neoclassical interior perfectly captures the mood of life in New York City society circles at this time and showcases the atmosphere created by a new kind of lighting that appeared, powered by gas. The darker front room is illuminated only by the spill from that light and the candlelight from the sconces. Nonetheless, the artist makes sure we can make out a chair and table clearly derived from the French Empire style glittering in the foreground. We can also note the difference in scale from the original French versions, as these pieces were created for people living in apartments. While English influence did not totally disappear after the Revolution, our relationship with England was, of course, in tatters, while our relationship with the French, who were largely responsible for our winning the war, deepened and continued, as France had followed our philosophical lead with their own revolution in 1789. Here, you see some typical forms of American Empire furniture made by the famous New York City joiner Charles-Honoré Lannuier. Born into a long line of French joiners, Lannuier had been trained in the great traditions of the Old World, but with the dissolution of the guilds after the Revolution and the evaporation of his clientele, he decided to emigrate to America in 1803 in search of new opportunity. At first glance, the French Empire style is quite evident. However, I've listed for you on the image page the ways in which the American Empire style differs. The Greek Revival style is another example of one of those perfect coincidences that occurred in the late Neoclassical era. In America, Greek Revival had a much deeper meaning than it did in England, for example, where it had been sparked in large part by the Elgin marbles. In America, the desire for this aesthetic arose from an appreciation of the fact that this new nation was the first democracy the world had seen since that established by the ancient Greeks. The symbolism was powerful and popular. In the furniture here, we see authenticity easily expressed in the chair forms, while the rest is based on French Empire and Regency forms. But it is the interior architecture and decoration, or lack thereof, that really communicates Greekness. The walls and ceiling are totally plain, despite a minimal central medallion. But the focal point are the paired iconic colonnades separating the spaces. The ornate quality of the furniture is even more apparent next to these stark, reserved surroundings, which leads again to that odd fact about Greek Revival furniture. It can sometimes be very ornate. Here, one of a famous suite of chairs made for the White House, attributed to a famous maker of furniture in this style, John Findlay. Clearly, the form is based on the Klismos chair, but it has been completely painted yellow and then accented in black and gilding with painted and stenciled ornament derived from classical antiquity, sometimes more Roman than Greek, but they weren't being picky. And besides, not many really knew the difference. So why would all of this ornament be necessary? Well, as I've stressed before, ornament is a highly visible, easily readable symbol. If you want to make a statement about whatever, create symbols that people can easily see and read. And this was certainly an attention-grabbing set of chairs. Likewise with the Greek sofas. Here, the forms are not really authentic. A couple of elements were derived from antiquity, but the whole is a modern invention. Similar forms were made in England, but of course the American had much more flair, more exuberant, tightly wound curves, and a rich blend of painted, gilded, and stenciled ornament. This kind of painted furniture is known as fancy furniture, and it was very popular at all price points. Why? Why would a kind of ornament normally considered vernacular be acceptable even at the White House? Think back to the first methods of ornament used by the early colonists and the important role paint played at that time. Even as conditions and wealth in the colonies improved, painted ornament remained and carried on, becoming an important part of the national psyche and identity. Here, some examples of a brand and style of fancy furniture that is synonymous with American 19th century culture, the chairs in particular, all made by the Hitchcock Chair Company in Connecticut, still operating today. Of course, there were examples of Greek Revival furniture that were much more reserved. Here, a set by Duncan Phyfe that really emphasizes simplified form, so much so that the little table is nothing more than a cylinder. And Greekness notwithstanding, we can also see a direct line back to the broad, flat geometric planes that comprised many French Empire and Louis Philippe pieces, most notably in the face of the curved sofa arms and the apron. As we know, Phyfe was at the forefront of using machines to produce his furniture, and in both form and technique, aesthetics such as this led directly to the last American style of the late Neoclassical era, called pillar and scroll. There, we'll see just what machines made possible as the late Neoclassical era gave way to the Industrial Age. I hope you can see how the pillar and scroll style evolved from Greek Revival. Pillar references plain cylindrical forms, like that of Phyfe's little table, as well as various other columnar elements, while scroll obviously refers to forms such as these, which evolved from shapes like those we saw in Phyfe's sofa. In fact, both terms, Greek Revival and pillar and scroll, are often used interchangeably, depending on how much Greekness is still apparent. Joseph Meeks was one of the first truly and fully industrial American furniture firms, and it was the ability of modern machinery to slice very thin veneers and tight curves that made possible the creation of elaborate scrolls like these, which are so characteristic of American design. While in the Meeks broadsheet to the right, you can identify items that still recall the authentic forms of classical antiquity, others, like these two tables, have become something completely different. Just as certain aspects of the Louis-Philippe style represented the unwinding, the dissolution of the late neoclassical era in France, so its counterpart in America, the pillar and scroll style, did the same. Like the Louis-Philippe style too, if we could read the fine print in Meeks's advertisement, we would see that the customer had the ability to choose from a variety of material and formal options to arrive at a price point they could afford. And as we'll see, it will be these new middle classes that will drive style in the Victorian era. The last of the late neoclassical styles we're going to look at is one of the most important. Why? Because of all the styles we've seen, it's the one that's most popular today among designers and sophisticated collectors. By the end of this section, you'll see why. We've seen that the farther we venture into the 19th century, the more furniture styles and production are dominated by the demands of the new middle classes. And the Biedermeier style is completely about middle-class life. In fact, the term Biedermeier itself was initially a derogatory term used by the elite to describe these new members of society. The style arose around the middle class in the German-speaking countries of Austria and Germany, where the political climate was such that many focused their activities on the home, finding ways to enjoy and entertain themselves, family, and friends in the comfort and privacy of their own homes. The rendering you see here is characteristic of these interiors in atmosphere as well as decoration, furniture, and its arrangement. Here, a black and white image, but a textbook example of a Biedermeier interior in the furniture and its arrangement. As in the previous image, sunlight and fresh air are also significant elements of the scheme. The influence of the Romantic movement, which was closely connected to the natural world, was considerable in these countries and complemented the respect for nature that had always been an important part of their culture. So if daily life is taking place mostly indoors, bringing the outdoors in would be a key consideration. Here, in an actual interior, you get a sense of the palette and the yellow golden toned fruit woods that are so characteristic of Biedermeier furniture. Not as expensive or elite as mahogany or satinwood, the fruit woods had a more natural and down-to-earth character that satisfied both a desire for authenticity and proximity to nature. Biedermeier pieces are usually always accented in some way with black detailing in actual ebony or ebonized woods. This often takes the form of thin lines called stringing, which in their way references the late neoclassical interest in crisp black line drawing. Noteworthy too, both here and in the preceding image, is the important role of the French Empire center table. Here, a variety of Biedermeier pieces from the early part of the period, when their origins in French Empire and Louis-Philippe are more apparent. Notice the broad, flat veneered surfaces that comprise every piece. Notice, too, the pier table and chair, both of which boast the large, flat, unwinding scrolls that are so characteristic of late neoclassical designs. We always seem to look to the chairs for the primary iconic example of a style, and here we see some examples of quintessential Biedermeier chairs. How did such a distinctive form arise? The signature shape of the back, usually with a gathered waist, blossoming into a bold, rounded crest rail, is perhaps related to late Greek revival forms, paired with the influence of new Victorian forms like the balloon-back chair that were beginning to appear. But when we're in decades like the 1830s and 40s, It's hard to say what influenced which first. Clearly, though, the broad, flat, plain veneered surfaces and classical forms and ornaments can be traced back to where and when. Here, just two examples of some of the more unusual Biedermeier forms, most of which appeared during the later period of the style, when the connection to authentic classical forms that started it all was becoming a distant memory. While these pieces are very unusual, furniture like this was not rare, and if you conduct any online search for Biedermeier furniture, you're sure to find some amazing pieces and astounding prices. Also evident here, as odd as they may be, these pieces still express not only the classic Biedermeier combination of blonde wood and black outlines, but also a connection to the distant origins of the style in the monumental architectural character and the large, broad, flat areas which provide the perfect platform for the display of expensive veneers. So that does it for the late neoclassical era and its styles, the period that formed the bridge from the old world to the new. But it's a very important period stylistically, too, if for no other reason than the simple fact that many of the styles we saw are still made, copied, collected, used as inspiration, and popular today. So even though it's a lot, it's material you'll need to be familiar with in your career. So hold on to this lecture for future reference. That's all for now. Over and out.